They handed me the mop like I was the help, like I was some quiet woman who knew her place and would be grateful to be told what to do. My son didn't even look at me when he did it. He just reached across the kitchen counter, picked it up from the corner by the pantry, and passed it into my hands as if he were passing a plate or a napkin, not as if he were handing me an order. His voice was pleasant enough, almost casual, as he said, "There's a spill in the hall, Mom. Could you get that before the guests arrive?" The words slipped out of him like he had asked me to fetch his jacket or straighten a crooked picture on the wall. But they landed heavy inside me, somewhere between my chest and my stomach, as if the weight of them had been waiting a long time to find the right moment to fall. I didn't say anything at first. I looked down at the mop in my hands, at the pale wood handle and the wet, gray tangle at the end of it. And I thought about how I had dressed that afternoon. My navy dress, the one I had ironed 2 days ago with the old iron that sputters steam like an old kettle. My best shoes with the leather my late husband had polished by hand before we went to his brother's wedding 30 years ago. My pearl clip-on earrings that aren't real but look respectable enough if the light hits them right. I had thought this was going to be a family dinner, maybe even a little celebration, the kind that starts with warm greetings at the door and ends with someone trying to send you home with the leftovers wrapped in foil. I had thought, if I'm honest, that I might get a picture with my grandchildren, one of those shots where you put your arms around each other and lean in close, so later, when you're alone, you can look at it and pretend the closeness was real. Instead, here I was, standing in my son's immaculate kitchen, a mop in my hands, and the realization settling on me like a heavy coat. I wasn't a guest here. I was staff. It had been years since I'd been in his home. Not this one. This was new, bigger, all pale walls and brushed steel, the sort of house with furniture you're not sure you're supposed to sit on, but in any home of his at all. When he bought it, he had sent me pictures by text. The front porch with its narrow columns, the wide windows in the living room, the back deck that looked like something from a magazine. He said they'd moved in during the summer, too busy to have visitors right away. The fall passed, then winter, then spring, and by the time I was invited, it was nearly a year since they had unpacked their boxes. I told myself it was life. People get busy. Children have their schedules. Work piles up. But when I stepped inside that evening, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. They hadn't been too busy. They had simply been waiting until the house looked the way they wanted, until it could present a certain image to the people who mattered to them. I was not one of those people. I saw it immediately in the way his wife looked me over as she opened the door, her smile quick and shallow, her eyes darting past me toward the driveway, as if checking to see if someone more important was pulling up behind me. She stepped aside, told me to come in, took my coat, but didn't offer to hang it anywhere in sight. Later, I would realize she had slipped it into the closet near the garage, not the one in the hall where the guests' jackets would go. The air inside smelled faintly of citrus and something more chemical. Cleaning products, expensive ones, the kind you buy not because they work better, but because the bottle looks good on the counter. There were no children's toys in sight, no stray shoes by the stairs, no clutter of daily life. Even the cushions on the couch sat perfectly straight, as if no one had leaned back on them yet. I followed her into the kitchen where my son stood by the island checking his phone. He glanced up, gave me a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Hey, Mom." "You made it," as if I had been in danger of missing my own son's invitation. He didn't ask about my flight or whether the cab had found the address easily. He just turned back to his screen. I stood there for a moment, holding the tin of lemon bars I had baked that morning, thinking of the way he used to devour them when he was a boy, coming in from the yard with scraped knees and grass stains, and a hunger only something homemade could fix. "Where should I put these?" I asked. His wife took them from me without looking at them. "Oh, just on the counter," she said. "We might have them later, but the caterer's bringing dessert." That was when I understood this wasn't a family dinner at all. It was a party, the kind where everyone knows their role and their place, and mine, apparently, was somewhere out of sight until I was needed for something useful. He gave me the mop as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I suppose for him it was. I had been cleaning up after him since before he could walk. But there was something different now, something colder. He didn't see it as help or care. He saw it as service, a given, a woman who owed him labor simply by existing. As I took the mop, I thought about the other times I had been invited into his life, only to find there was no real place for me. The birthdays where I sat at the edge of the group, smiling while the children opened gifts I hadn't known they wanted. The holidays where I was told there wasn't room at the table so I could relax in the living room with a plate on my lap. The calls that came only when something needed fixing, money for a deposit, help with a move, someone to watch the kids last minute. And still, every time I went, I told myself it was family, that it was better to be there than to be absent, even if being there meant being invisible. Now, with the mop in my hand and the sound of voices drifting in from the front hall where the first guests were arriving, I realized I had mistaken invisibility for closeness for far too long. I walked to the hallway and saw the spill, a glass of wine knocked over, spreading into the fibers of a pale rug. The kind of rug you buy knowing you'll tell people to take their shoes off before stepping on it. I pressed the mop into it, watched the liquid darken the strands before the gray thread soaked it away. My son's voice carried from the doorway, warm and charming, greeting someone by name, laughing. It was the voice he saved for the people he wanted to impress, the people whose approval he valued. It had been a long time since I had heard it directed at me. I stayed there a moment longer than I needed to, my back to the room, my hands on the handle. I could feel the dampness of the mop head through the wood, smell the faint tang of the wine mixed with the lemony cleaner. In the corner of my eye, I saw his suit jacket draped over a chair, the fabric dark and smooth, the kind of jacket that costs more than I spend on groceries in a month. I knew it wasn't an accident he'd left it there. He'd probably planned to put it on just before stepping out to greet everyone properly. And yet, something about the sight of it resting so carelessly sparked something in me that I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not exactly. Something sharper. A kind of clarity. I straightened slowly, feeling the pull in my knees, and leaned the mop against the wall. From the kitchen, I could hear his wife laughing. That light, rehearsed laugh that sounds like a clinking glass. I looked again at the jacket. The fabric caught the light from the chandelier above, showing the deep navy weave, the perfect stitching. My son's laughter joined hers in the other room, and in that sound I heard not joy, but triumph. The triumph of a man who believes the story he has told about himself, the one in which he has risen above the kind of life where a mother is anything but. A silent backdrop. I had been helping him tell that story for years, standing just out of frame. And I realized in that moment that I didn't want to be in his picture at all. So I picked up the mop again, but this time I also picked up the jacket. I still remember the way the words hit me that night, sharp and cold like the wind that cuts through bare branches in late November. It wasn't just the mop, not just the silent dismissal that came with it. It was what came after, the unspoken message wrapped in politeness. That final gesture that sealed the truth between us. My son stood in the living room surrounded by his guests, successful people with their tailored suits and carefully curated smiles, and he looked over his shoulder at me with a flicker of impatience. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but clipped, "why don't you just stay in the kitchen tonight? You don't have to come out here. We've got it covered." There was no invitation in the tone, no warmth, only a polite command disguised as concern. I felt my heart constrict, the tight band of betrayal squeezing around it, but I forced a smile and nodded. Of course I nodded. What else was there to do when the people you raised treat you like an awkward secret, like a page in a photo album you'd rather hide? That night was the moment I realized the house I had once dreamed of visiting as a home was no longer mine. The party went on without me, laughter and clinking glasses drifting in from the grand room beyond the narrow doorway where I stood, almost invisible. My son greeted his guests with practiced charm, asking about careers, vacations, the latest neighborhood developments. But when his eyes met mine across the room, they looked through me, as if I were a ghost standing in a place I had no right to be. I watched as his wife whispered something to him, their heads close together, the kind of intimate exchange that shuts others out. I was standing right there, but it was as if I had been erased, folded neatly into the background of their carefully constructed lives. I told myself that I could bear it, that it was only a night, that families sometimes drifted apart without meaning to, but the sting of it, the knowledge that I was no longer part of their world, that I was something to be hidden away rather than embraced, gnawed at me long after the guests had left and the lights were dimmed. Later, when the house fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of a clock I didn't recognize, I found myself standing by the window, staring out at the city lights blinking in the dark. The wind pressed against the glass, cold and insistent, as if urging me to look beyond this place, beyond the roles I had been assigned and the illusions I had lived with. I realized then that the mop wasn't just a cleaning tool. It was a symbol of how they saw me. Someone disposable, expected to scrub away the messes of their lives without question or gratitude. The next morning brought no apology, no invitation to talk, just the quiet continuation of a life that no longer included me. I found myself standing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where the night before I had been reduced to a servant, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold. The silence around me was thick, heavy, filled with the absence of the warmth I had hoped for. As I looked at the pristine countertops and the gleaming appliances, I thought about all the years I had poured into my family, the countless meals cooked, the school projects supervised, the illnesses nursed, the birthday parties planned, and how none of it had been enough to secure a place at this table, a place in this life. It was during that morning, as the sunlight sifted weakly through the curtains and dust motes danced in the quiet air, that I made a decision. I knew that if I stayed, I would become smaller and smaller, swallowed whole by their polite neglect and unspoken disdain. So I began to think about what I might do, where I might go. The idea of leaving the house, leaving the city, the neighborhood, the memories, filled me with a strange mix of fear and relief. It was terrifying to imagine starting over at my age, alone and without the familiar faces of family nearby. But it was also a release, a chance to reclaim a part of myself I had long forgotten beneath the layers of sacrifice and silence. I started packing that afternoon. Not much, just a small suitcase with a few changes of clothes, some medications, and a book I had never finished reading. I took my old leather purse, the one my husband had given me years ago, and stuffed it with the essentials. As I zipped the suitcase closed, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want the pity or the questions, the attempts to persuade me to stay or promises to change. I knew from experience that those words were empty, that love could be conditional and fragile, and that sometimes the only way to be seen was to step away from the stage altogether. That night, I slipped out of the house quietly, leaving the keys on the kitchen counter and the note I never had the courage to write. The air was cool and fresh as I walked to the bus stop, my steps steady despite the weight of years and disappointment pressing down on me. The city lights shimmered around me, distant and cold, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking to fit in or please anyone. I was looking for myself. The bus came and went, and I took the next one heading toward a place I barely remembered but had once called home. A city with rainy streets and a small apartment where I had lived before the chaos of life pulled me away. The hours on the bus were long and quiet, filled with the low hum of the engine and the murmur of strangers around me. I watched the landscape change from the bright, manicured suburbs to the more worn and weathered streets of the city center. Each mile felt like a step away from the woman I had been and a step closer to the woman I was becoming. I wasn't sure what awaited me there, whether I would find peace or loneliness, but I knew that staying was no longer an option. The weight of the mop and the silence of that night had given me a new kind of clarity, a bitter gift that cut away the illusions and left me standing bare and real. When I finally arrived, the city was dark but alive with lights and sounds that felt both foreign and familiar. I found a small motel with peeling paint and a faded sign, a place that promised nothing but a roof over my head and a chance to breathe. The room was sparse. A bed, a lamp, a window that looked out onto a cracked sidewalk, but it was mine for as long as I needed. I unpacked my suitcase slowly, laying out my clothes and the book I had brought with me, and I sat by the window drinking a cup of tea that tasted like hope and resolve. Outside, the rain began to fall softly, tapping against the glass like a quiet lullaby, and for the first time in years, I felt a moment of peace. In the days that followed, I took small steps toward rebuilding my life. I walked the streets, bought a coat at a thrift store that fit like a promise, and found work tutoring children in the neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and it was mine. I didn't call my son or his wife. I wasn't ready for their voices, their apologies, or their explanations. Instead, I chose silence, a silence that spoke louder than any words. The mop was left behind in that kitchen, a symbol of what I was shedding, and I carried with me something stronger, the quiet determination to be seen, not as a burden or a shadow, but as a woman who still had a life to live. And so the betrayal, the catalyst that once seemed like a cruel joke, became the spark that set me free. It was not the end, but the beginning of a new story, one I was writing for myself, one mop stroke at a time, one step into the unknown that was finally mine to claim. The days following that night unfolded like the slow turning of a heavy, forgotten page, each moment steeped in the quiet realization that my place in my son's life was no longer what I had believed it to be. I was no longer the mother who mattered, no longer the woman whose presence was sought for comfort or celebration, but rather a shadow hovering on the edge, tolerated but never truly welcomed. The weight of that truth settled deep into my bones, a persistent ache beneath the surface of my skin that neither time nor distraction could soothe. I found myself retreating further into silence, not because I wanted to, but because there seemed to be nothing left to say. My voice, once confident and warm, had been reduced to a whisper in a house that had never truly been mine. Each morning I woke in the small motel room I had found after leaving my son's house, the one with the peeling paint and threadbare curtains that fluttered in the cold breeze when I cracked open the window. The city outside was both familiar and strange, a mosaic of cracked sidewalks and blooming trees, the distant hum of traffic blending with the occasional bark of a dog or the call of a bird. I walked these streets slowly, sometimes with purpose, sometimes aimlessly, letting my feet carry me where they would as I tried to piece together what came next. The rhythm of my days became steady but cautious. Wake, walk, eat, rest, repeat. In the mornings, I visited the small coffee shop on the corner, a modest place with chipped paint and a bell that jingled softly when the door opened. I began working there as a part-time waitress, a role I took on not out of necessity alone, but because it gave me a structure, a reason to leave my room and face the world beyond my own thoughts. The work was humble but honest. I learned to carry trays again, to memorize orders, to greet customers with a smile that came from a place deeper than routine. The kitchen was small, the coffee strong and bitter, the mornings filled with the murmur of regulars who came in seeking warmth and familiarity. The owner, a woman named Joyce, was a no-nonsense kind of person, gruff but fair, who didn't ask questions about my past and didn't expect anything but reliability and quiet competence. In her presence, I found a kind of unexpected freedom, the freedom to be simply a worker, a person among others, not the forgotten mother or the unwelcome guest. There was dignity in the work, in the simple act of serving others, and slowly I began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been buried beneath years of neglect and silence. At first, the nights were the hardest. In the motel room, the shadows stretched long and the loneliness pressed in with an almost physical weight. I thought often of the home I had left, of the family that had let me slip quietly out the door without a backward glance. I remembered the laughter in that gleaming kitchen, the sound of my son's voice as he dismissed me, the careless way he had tossed his jacket aside as if it were nothing more than a rag. But instead of breaking me, these memories began to fuel a quiet fire inside. I found myself writing again, notes, fragments of thought, letters never sent. I wrote about the woman I had been, the mother I had loved, the life I was leaving behind, and the one I was beginning to build. Writing became a balm for the wounds that no one else saw, a way to speak my truth when my voice felt too fragile to be heard aloud. The city around me was full of unexpected kindnesses. A neighbor helped me carry groceries once, a young woman with bright eyes and a quick smile who told me she worked at the library and loved books. I found a second-hand coat in a dusty shop, a navy wool piece with deep pockets and a subtle pattern that felt like a shield against the cold and the world's indifference. I wore it proudly even when the threads showed through because it was mine, a choice made for myself, not handed down or borrowed from someone else. Each small act of self-care, each purchase made with my own money, each moment spent alone but not lonely, was a step away from the shadow I had inhabited for so long. There were moments of doubt and fear, of course, fear that I had made a mistake, that I was too old to start over, that the gap between my past and my future was too wide to cross. But these moments passed, overtaken by a growing sense of resolve. I began to see that freedom was not something granted by others, but something I had to claim for myself. I was no longer willing to be the woman who waited quietly for someone else's permission to exist. I was becoming the woman who walked her own path, who chose her own way, who refused to be diminished. In the quiet hours before dawn, I often sat by the window, watching the city wake beneath a sky brushed with pale pink and gray. I thought of the mop I had held that night, the spill I had been asked to clean, and the suit jacket I had used instead of a rag, a silent act of defiance that marked the moment I stopped being invisible. That jacket, soaked and dirty, was more than fabric. It was a symbol of the life I had left behind and the life I was building now, stitch by stitch. I felt a strange kinship with it, a reminder that sometimes what is discarded can be transformed into something new and strong. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing one, the ache in my feet from standing grew less sharp, replaced by a steady strength that surprised me. I began to look forward to the rhythm of my work at the cafe, the steady stream of customers, the quiet camaraderie with Joyce and the other staff. I found joy in small things, the way the sun filtered through the windows in the morning, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the crisp pages of a crossword puzzle left by a regular customer. These simple pleasures, once overlooked or taken for granted, became the building blocks of a new life, one not defined by loss, but by possibility. Occasionally, I thought of my son and the family I had left behind. I did not call or write, not out of bitterness, but because I was not yet ready to re-enter that world on their terms. I was still learning to stand on my own, to find my voice without apology or explanation. I knew there would come a time when I might reach out, when the past and the present could meet without pain or resentment. But for now, I held on to the quiet dignity of my choice, the peace that came from knowing I was finally walking away from the place where I had been invisible toward a life where I could be seen. This was my first true step beyond the betrayal, beyond the humiliation. It was a slow, steady climb out of the shadows, a process marked by small victories and quiet moments of clarity. Each day I chose to keep going was an act of resistance against the narrative that had sought to erase me. And in that choice, I found not just survival, but the flicker of something more. A life reclaimed, a a self remembered, a future yet to be written. The moment of clarity that marked the beginning of my new life came not with a sudden revelation, but as a quiet unfolding, a slow awakening that stirred something long dormant within me. It was in the soft light of an early morning, as the city around me stirred from sleep, and the sky blushed with the first tentative hues of dawn, that I felt the stirrings of a different kind of strength. Not the strength forged in years of sacrifice and silent endurance, but a gentler, fiercer power, born of choice and self-respect. I had arrived at a crossroads, one that demanded I decide not just where I would live, but who I would be in the life that stretched ahead. The small room I had rented above the laundromat was modest, but mine, and every corner of it whispered possibilities I had almost forgotten could exist. The walls, painted a soft cream, caught the morning light and made the space glow warmly, a stark contrast to the cold, polished surfaces of the home I had left behind. On the windowsill, a tiny pot of lavender sent up its sweet, calming scent, a small act of care I had allowed myself as a symbol of new beginnings. I spent my days in the rhythm of simple routines, brewing tea, tending to the few plants I had brought with me, reading books lent by a kind librarian I met on one of my walks through the neighborhood. Each page turned was like a step taken away from the shadows and closer to the light of rediscovery. Working at Joyce's Cafe had become more than a means to support myself. It was a place where I slowly reclaimed my dignity and sense of belonging. Joyce, with her gruff kindness and no-nonsense manner, never pried into my past, but her presence was a steady anchor in the swirling uncertainty of my new life. She taught me the art of efficiency, the grace of quiet service, and the value of showing up every day, no matter how small the task. The mornings were filled with the hum of espresso machines, the clatter of cups and plates, and the soft murmur of regulars whose lives intersected briefly with mine over steaming mugs of coffee. It was in those moments, beneath the fluorescent kitchen lights and behind the worn counter, that I began to feel the subtle yet profound shift from invisibility to presence. I had never imagined myself as a waitress, yet here I was, moving with a steady purpose, a gentle authority in my hands as I refilled cups and took orders. The customers were a patchwork of stories: a nurse who greeted me with a tired smile, a contractor who joked about the weather, an elderly man who told me about the cardinals he'd spotted in his backyard. These encounters, small and seemingly insignificant, became threads in the tapestry of my renewed life, weaving me into a community that acknowledged me without judgment or expectation. With each day, the ache in my feet and hands, the remnants of a life once constrained by others' demands, softened and gave way to a quiet strength that surprised me. One afternoon, after a particularly busy shift, I found myself standing in front of a small second-hand clothing shop I had noticed during my walks. The sign was faded and the window display cluttered, but something drew me inside. A need to mark my transformation with something tangible. The shopkeeper, a young woman with kind eyes and a ready smile, helped me find a navy wool coat with a subtle herringbone pattern and deep pockets that seemed made for holding more than just the chill of the coming winter. When I tried it on, the coat fit like a second skin, wrapping me in warmth and quiet dignity. Paying for it with my own money, the crisp bills tucked into my wallet like a secret promise, I felt a swell of pride that no one in that distant past had ever allowed me to feel. The coat became a symbol of my reclamation, a garment that belonged to me and no one else. I wore it on my walks through the neighborhood, feeling the fabric hold me steady as I explored streets lined with unfamiliar faces and the scent of freshly baked bread. I stopped by the corner bakery more often, sometimes chatting with the baker, a woman who shared stories of her grandchildren and the seasons of the year. These small connections, forged in the warmth of shared space and quiet conversation, began to fill the emptiness left by years of estrangement and silence. Evenings were a time of reflection and gentle healing. I would sit by the window, the navy coat draped over the back of my chair, a cup of tea warming my hands, and read from an old paperback novel I had carried with me. The words on the pages offered a refuge, a portal into other lives and possibilities, and I clung to them like a lifeline. Sometimes Joyce would bring a bottle of wine and we would share a quiet drink on the porch, her cigarette smoke curling into the night air as she spoke softly about city politics or the oddities of her neighbors. In those moments, I realized that companionship could be found not only in family, but in chosen connections, in the gentle acceptance of someone who sees you for who you are without judgment or expectation. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, a cold shadow that settled over my heart and whispered doubts about the path I had chosen. Memories of the past, of the house where I was asked to mop, of the laughter that excluded me, of the faces that turned away, would rise unbidden, threatening to undo the fragile peace I had found. Yet even in those dark moments I held fast to the understanding that my worth was not measured by their acceptance or approval. I was learning to love myself in ways I never had before, to honor the woman who had carried me through storms and still stood, even if battered and bruised. The turning point came quietly. A simple letter slipped under my door one morning, unsigned but filled with words of encouragement and understanding. It was from Kieran, my grandson, the only one in the family who had ever reached out without hesitation or judgment. His letter spoke of missing me, of hoping I was safe and happy, of offering a bridge between the past and the present that did not demand I abandon my newfound life. Holding that letter in my hands, feeling the warmth of his words, I allowed myself to imagine a future where connection could exist on my terms. A future where I was not a shadow, but a woman fully alive. With each passing day, I grew more certain that this was not just survival, but a new beginning. The coat on my shoulders, the warmth in my heart, and the quiet strength in my steps became the armor I wore against the ghosts of rejection and invisibility. I was no longer the woman who waited in the kitchen with a mop, unseen and unheard. I was a woman who had chosen herself, who had reclaimed her life not by returning to what was lost, but by forging something entirely new. In this new life, every small act mattered. The purchase of a coat, the smile shared with a stranger, the letter received from a grandson, the steady rhythm of work and rest. These were the building blocks of my freedom, the quiet markers of a journey from the shadows into light. And as I looked ahead, wrapped in the soft embrace of my navy coat and the promise of days yet to come, I knew that this was only the beginning of a story I would tell on my own terms, with courage, grace, and an unshakable sense of self. The second escalation in my journey came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a shadow lengthening in the fading light of an afternoon. But it grew steadily, a creeping pressure that tested the fragile new life I had begun to build. It began with a letter, simple and unassuming, slipped under the door of my small apartment one chilly morning. The paper slightly worn, the edges softened from handling. The handwriting was familiar, my grandson Kieran's, the one who had always been the bridge between me and the family I thought I'd lost. His words were tentative, yet filled with warmth, a lifeline thrown across the chasm that had opened between us. He wrote about missing me, about wondering if I was safe and well, and about hoping that if I was ready, I might consider reconnecting. That letter stirred something deep inside me, a mixture of hope and hesitation, a reminder that even in the coldest winter, there could be signs of spring. Kieran's letter was soon followed by a visit from Lisa, my son's wife, an intrusion into my quiet world that I had not anticipated but could no longer ignore. She appeared one gray afternoon at the cafe where I worked, standing by the pastry display with an expression carefully crafted to convey concern, but tinged with something sharper beneath the surface. A look I recognized all too well from years past. She was dressed impeccably, as if to assert her place in a world I was no longer part of. her voice soft but firm as she asked to speak with me privately. I agreed, leading her to a small booth at the back, away from the steady hum of morning customers and the clatter of dishes. There, in the muted light, she spoke of panic and worry, of how my disappearance had upended their carefully ordered lives, how Adam, my son, was furious and desperate to find me, how the children were confused and hurt. Her words were rehearsed but not entirely false. There was genuine fear beneath the polished veneer. Yet, even as she spoke, I saw the unspoken demand lurking in the spaces between her sentences, the expectation that I would return, that I would resume the role they had cast me in, the role I had rejected. Following Lisa's visit came the lawyer, a man named Derek Sorensen, sent by my son and daughter-in-law to ensure my well-being and discuss next steps. He arrived at the cafe unannounced, his presence formal and intrusive, a reminder that the family's concern was as much about control as it was about care. Derek spoke carefully, his words chosen to sound reasonable and compassionate, but there was an edge beneath the surface, a legal precision that made it clear they intended to reclaim what they saw as theirs. My time, my money, my very person. I met his gaze steadily, refusing to be cowed or diminished. I told him plainly that my well-being was excellent and that my affairs were my own business. I had not come this far to be treated like a child or a ward, and I was not about to let them rewrite my story. The pressure continued with the arrival of a newspaper article, a front-page feature in the local community section that portrayed me as a missing matriarch, a vulnerable woman lost to the world. The article quoted my son and daughter-in-law, their words a mix of worry and blame, painting a picture of a family torn apart by my absence. The language was clinical and detached, a performance designed to elicit sympathy while reinforcing the narrative that I was a problem to be solved. Reading it, I felt a mix of anger and incredulity, how easily they reduced me to a headline, how casually they cast me as fragile and needy when I was anything but. The article was a reminder that, in their eyes, I was still the invisible woman, the inconvenient truth they preferred to hide behind closed doors. Amidst these pressures, there were moments of unexpected kindness and connection that sustained me. Kieran's continued letters and phone calls were a lifeline, his voice a balm that soothed some of the ache left by years of neglect and misunderstanding. His presence in my life, though distant and tentative, was a reminder that family could be redefined, that love could exist without conditions or expectations. I found solace in the small rituals of my new life, the quiet mornings at the cafe, the walks through the neighborhood, the evenings spent with Joyce, who had become not just a friend but a steadfast companion. Her gruff humor and steady presence were a counterpoint to the chaos of the past, a grounding force that reminded me I was not alone. Yet, the encroaching demands of my son's family could not be ignored. Their attempts to draw me back into their world, to recast me in a role I had abandoned, forced me to confront the limits of forgiveness and the boundaries I needed to set. I began to understand that this was not just about family dynamics, but about power and autonomy, about reclaiming my right to define my own life without interference or control. Each letter, each visit, each legal threat was a test of my resolve, a challenge I met with quiet determination and growing clarity. The turning point came when I sent a letter of my own, not to Adam or Lisa, but to Kieran. In it, I expressed my love and gratitude for his kindness, my refusal to return to a life that had diminished me, and my hope that one day we could meet on my terms. It was a letter of both connection and boundary, a declaration that while I valued family, I would not sacrifice my dignity or peace for the sake of appearances or obligation. Sending that letter was an act of courage and defiance, a step toward healing that embraced both separation and possibility. In the weeks that followed, I felt the weight of the family's gaze lessen, replaced by the gentle warmth of chosen connections and self-respect. I continued to build my life with deliberate care, working, walking, reading, and nurturing the small joys that had once seemed out of reach. The pressure remained, but it no longer dictated my path. I was learning to live not in reaction to their demands, but in alignment with my own truth. This period of second escalation was a crucible, a time of testing and growth that forged in me a deeper understanding of freedom and selfhood. It was painful and fraught with uncertainty, but it was also a necessary passage, a passage that led me from the shadows of exclusion into the light of agency. And as I navigated these challenges, I found within myself a strength I had long forgotten, a strength born not of endurance alone, but of choice, a strength that would carry me forward into the climax of my story and the promise of a life truly my own. I had carried the weight of their expectations, their dismissals, and their silent judgments for so long that when the moment of reckoning finally arrived, it did not come with the grand flourish I might have imagined in my younger days. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match or tearful plea. Instead, it was a quiet, deliberate act, an assertion of self that rippled outward with a power born of years spent in the shadows. The night I chose to reclaim my dignity, I stood in the kitchen of the home that had once been my son's sanctuary and felt for the first time in decades the full measure of my own worth. That evening, the house was alive with the chatter and laughter of guests, a celebration I had once believed would include me as a cherished presence. Instead, I was again relegated to the periphery, tasked with tasks that felt both absurd and infuriating. Cleaning spills, tidying up after strangers, being seen but not truly seen. My son moved through the crowd with ease, the perfect host, his smile practiced, his charm effortless. But when he passed by me in the kitchen, his eyes barely met mine, and the briefest shadow of impatience flickered across his face. I held the mop in my hands, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and I glanced down at his suit jacket, draped carelessly over a chair nearby. The fabric was pristine, untouched by the chaos of the evening, a symbol of the life he had built, one that no longer had room for me. In that moment, something within me shifted. I felt the weight of years of invisibility and silence press down, and with it, a fierce clarity that cut through the fog of hurt and resignation. I stepped forward, mop in one hand, the jacket in the other, and moved toward the center of the kitchen. The room grew quiet, the sounds of conversation and laughter fading into the background as eyes turned toward me, some wide with surprise, others narrowing in judgment. I knelt down, dipping the mop into the bucket of soapy water, then lifted the suit jacket and began to wipe at the floor with it. Slow and deliberate strokes that soaked the fabric in water and dust. The act was simple, but charged with meaning, a reversal of roles, a silent declaration that I would no longer be the one to clean up after others without respect or recognition. The guests watched, stunned into silence, as the fabric darkened and weighed heavy in my hands. My son's face went pale, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. The laughter that had filled the room was replaced by a heavy stillness, an unspoken acknowledgement of a boundary crossed and a dignity reclaimed. I stood, the dripping jacket heavy at my side, and met my son's gaze steadily. "There," I said softly, my voice steady despite the tumult inside me. "I finally cleaned up after your mess." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge and a closing of a chapter. I turned then, without looking back, and walked out the door into the cool night air, the sounds of the party muffled behind me. Outside, the world felt vast and open. The sky stretched wide above me, the streetlights casting pools of gold on the pavement. I walked slowly, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs and the steady beat of my own footsteps beneath me. The mop and jacket were left behind, symbols of a life I was shedding, and ahead lay the uncharted path of a future I would shape on my own terms. That night, in the solitude of my small apartment, I allowed myself to feel the full scope of what had happened. Not just the rejection and pain, but the power and freedom that came with standing up for myself. I was no longer a silent observer in the story of my life, but its author. A woman who had refused to be diminished and had reclaimed her voice and her place in the world. In the days that followed, the echoes of that night rippled through my new life. The guests at the party whispered among themselves. The guests who had once ignored me now, aware that I was no longer invisible. My son did not reach out, did not call or write, and I did not expect him to. My act was not one of vengeance but of closure, a clear, irrevocable statement that I would no longer accept anything less than respect and dignity. Instead, I focused on the life I was building, work that grounded me, friendships that nourished me, and moments of quiet joy that reminded me I was more than the sum of others' neglect. I wore the navy coat I had purchased not long before with a newfound pride, the fabric a shield against the cold and the past. I continued to nurture my small garden of self-respect, tending to it with patience and love. The mop and the jacket, once symbols of humiliation and exclusion, became for me emblems of transformation, reminders that sometimes the things meant to diminish us can become the tools of our liberation. I kept a photo of the jacket, faded and damp, taped inside my dresser drawer as a talisman, a symbol of the night I chose myself over silence. And so, in the quiet aftermath of that evening, I found not just an end but a beginning, a chance to live fully and freely, to embrace the woman I had always been beneath the layers of expectation and erasure. I learned that reclaiming dignity is not a grand gesture, but a series of small, deliberate acts, each one a step toward the life we deserve. If you find yourself in the place I once was, holding a mop handed down with disregard, standing on the edges of a life that no longer fits, know that you have within you the power to rewrite your story. You can choose to drop the rag, to lift your head, and to walk away into the light of your own making. That night, I did just that, and I have never looked back. The days after that night unfolded with a quiet grace I had not known for years, a gentle easing of tension and a soft opening of space where I could finally breathe without the weight of expectation pressing down on my chest. I woke each morning to the soft light filtering through the thin curtains of my small apartment, the familiar hum of the city waking around me, and the steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. It was a life marked not by grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations, but by small moments of peace and presence that stitched together a tapestry of healing and renewal. The mop and the suit jacket, once symbols of humiliation and exclusion, had become talismans of transformation, reminders that I had crossed a threshold from invisibility to presence, from silence to voice. In the weeks that followed, I continued to build my new life with deliberate care, finding strength in routine and joy in simple pleasures. I walked the neighborhood streets with the navy coat wrapped tightly around me, the pockets holding small treasures, a folded letter from Kieran, a photograph tucked inside a book, a pressed leaf from a tree outside the cafe where I worked. These objects, humble and ordinary, became anchors in a world that was still shifting beneath my feet. At work, I found a steady rhythm, the early mornings filled with the rich aroma of coffee and the friendly banter of customers who came to know me not as a visitor or an outsider, but as part of their daily lives. Joyce, with her gruff humor and steady presence, became more than an employer. She was a friend and a witness to my quiet journey. The letter from Kieran remained close to my heart, a symbol of the love that endured despite distance and silence. His words spoke of hope and forgiveness, of a bond that did not demand perfection but celebrated presence. One afternoon, after my shift at the cafe, I found a note waiting for me, an invitation to meet, simple and unadorned, asking if I might come to the Red Fern Motel where he was staying during a brief visit to the city. The thought of seeing him again stirred a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. but I knew that this meeting was a step I needed to take, not just for him, but for myself. When the day arrived, I dressed carefully, choosing the navy coat that had become my armor and my comfort. I did not tell Joyce where I was going, and she did not ask, her respect for my privacy a quiet gift. The motel was modest but clean, its faded sign welcoming travelers like me who sought refuge and new beginnings. Kieran opened the door before I could knock, his face lighting up with a smile that held both familiarity and newness. The years between us folded away in that simple moment. We sat together in the small room, the air thick with unspoken words and the warmth of reconnection. There were no tears, no demands, just the gentle unfolding of a relationship renewed on terms that honored both of us. In the days that followed, I carried the memory of that meeting like a light inside me, a reminder that love could be both fragile and resilient, that family could be redefined and rebuilt without erasing the pain of the past. I continued to write letters, to Kieran, to myself, to the woman I was becoming, each word a thread weaving together the story of survival and hope. I found solace in the quiet moments of solitude and the unexpected connections that blossomed in the ordinary rhythms of life. Joyce and I celebrated small victories, the first paycheck that was truly mine, the purchase of a book I had long wanted to read, the slow unfolding of friendships that did not demand anything but presence. We baked lemon squares for a community potluck, sharing laughter and stories with neighbors who welcomed me without question or judgment. In these moments, I felt the roots of belonging grow deeper, anchoring me to a life that was fully and unapologetically my own. The final letters I wrote were not to the family that had cast me aside, but to the figures who represented their attempts to control me. Letters that drew clear boundaries and affirmed my autonomy. I declared with steady hand and clear mind that I was safe, sound, and not under duress, that further attempts at interference would be met with legal resistance. These letters were acts of closure, the final chapters in a story of release and reclamation. As the seasons turned, I stood on my porch, wrapped in my navy coat, watching the world move around me with a calm acceptance. The mop and jacket were memories now, symbols of a past transformed by courage and choice. I had stepped out of the shadows and into a life defined not by others' demands, but by my own truth. If this story finds you in a moment of doubt or despair, know that it is never too late to choose yourself, to walk away from the roles others assign and toward the life you deserve. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are the author of your own story, and it is waiting to be written with strength, grace, and love.